In June 1944, when British troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, they were carrying a rifle that was already close to half a century old. The Lee-Enfield short magazine version had been designed back in 1895 and officially adopted in 1907. Meanwhile, their German opponents carried the Carabiner 98K, a modern evolution of the legendary Mauser action, honed over decades. On paper, the German rifle should have had the edge. It was more accurate at long distances, built with newer materials, and widely considered by experts to be the peak of bolt-action design. Yet, time and again, British soldiers who seized German rifles on the battlefield would ditch them and stick with their Lee-Enfields. This wasn't stubbornness or nostalgia. It was practical wisdom earned through brutal experience. The story of the Lee-Enfield begins in the 1880s, when the British Army realized it needed a repeating rifle capable of using smokeless powder. James Paris Lee, a Scottish-Canadian inventor, had created a groundbreaking detachable box magazine. Pair that with the rifling work from the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, and the result was the Magazine Lee-Enfield. It first saw action in the Second Boer War, and by 1907, after multiple refinements, the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III had emerged, the iconic SMLE that would fight through 2 world wars and countless colonial campaigns. What made this rifle endure for nearly a century wasn't a single flashy innovation. It was a series of smart, practical choices that focused on what truly mattered in combat. At the time, most armies were obsessed with long-range accuracy, aiming at targets 800, 1,000, or even 2,500 yards away. The Germans in particular prided themselves on precision, and their Mauser rifles reflected that philosophy with longer barrels and incredibly tight tolerances. The British went in a very different direction with the SMLE. They shortened the barrel to just over 25 inches, making it much easier to handle in trenches, vehicles, and tight spaces. Sure, it sacrificed a bit of long-range accuracy, but studies of real combat had shown that most firefights happened within 300 yards. To European military theorists, this was almost heresy. But once trench warfare erupted after 1914, that decision proved genius. The SMLE's rear-locking bolt also raised eyebrows among firearms experts. Most armies, including the Germans with their Mauser, used front-locking systems, lugs near the chamber that absorbed the firing pressure. The Lee-Enfield's lugs were at the back, which on paper made it weaker and less precise. Critics scoffed. On a test range, they were right. But war isn't a range, and the SMLE's design gave soldiers advantages that mattered far more than tiny differences at 600 yards. The longer bolt travel actually made the rifle faster to cycle, and its action was more forgiving in mud, dust, and grime. By 1939, when Britain went to war with Germany again, the SMLE looked outdated. Yet instead of retiring it, factories across Britain, India, and Australia cranked out millions more. This wasn't blind tradition. Commanders understood a rifle that looks perfect on paper doesn't always win battles. British training made the SMLE deadly. Every soldier had to fire 15 aimed rounds per minute from the bolt-action rifle, and the most skilled could double that to 30. This was the mad minute, not a peacetime stunt, but a core tactical skill that saved countless lives. On August 23, 1914, at Mons in Belgium, roughly 70,000 British troops faced almost 160,000 Germans. The invaders expected an easy victory, but they ran straight into a wall of fire so intense that German commanders swore they were being cut down by machine guns. They weren't. They were facing highly trained British riflemen, unleashing the SMLE at top speed. The rifle itself made this possible. Its bolt handle sat at a 60-degree angle, shorter than the 90-degree handles common on other rifles, meaning less movement between shots and more natural hand positioning. The rear-locking bolt let the firing pin hit on closing rather than opening, making rapid fire smoother. Spent casings ejected easily, letting the soldier focus entirely on chambering the next round. Combined with relentless training, this turned ordinary soldiers into incredibly lethal weapons on their own. British recruits spent weeks at rifle ranges before learning any other combat skills, drilling over and over from standing, kneeling, sitting, and prone positions. By the time they hit the battlefield, their SMLEs were an extension of themselves, fast, reliable, and devastating. British soldiers drilled until their hands moved almost on autopilot. They practiced swapping a fresh 10-round magazine in under 3 seconds and learned to judge distances by eye, adjusting the SMLE's ladder sights in an instant. Those sights may have looked old-fashioned next to German rifles, but in combat, they were pure practicality. Flip a lever, slide to the right range, lock it down. No overthinking, no fiddling, just raw speed under pressure. At qualification, the so-called mad minute demanded hitting a 12-inch target at 300 yards 15 times in 60 seconds. That meant reloading mid-drill without missing a beat. Soldiers who managed 20 hits earned marksman status. Legendary instructor Sergeant Snooksall reportedly scored 38 hits in a minute during a 1914 demo, though he had an assistant feeding magazines. The goal wasn't records. It was muscle memory, drilled so deep that accuracy under chaos became automatic. At Mons, German soldiers advancing in neat formations were cut down at distances where they couldn't effectively fire back. After-action reports describe entire companies frozen in place, convinced they were facing sustained machine gun fire from multiple positions. In truth, small groups of 8 to 10 British riflemen produced that volume of fire. A captured German lieutenant later told interrogators he had counted the rate of fire and assumed they were facing at least 20 machine guns. He couldn't fathom that bolt-action rifles could unleash that much devastation. At Mons, the British had only 4 machine guns per battalion. The rest, rifles, training, and the SMLE performing exactly as it was designed. Trench warfare was a nightmare for gun designers. Any rifle that looked elegant in a factory could fail spectacularly on the Western Front. Weapons spent days in rain, snow, and the thick, corrosive mud of Flanders. A clay-heavy soup that seeped into every crevice. Soldiers had no clean workspace, no heated armory, no luxury of proper oil. They used whatever rag and leftover oil they could find, and this is where the Lee-Enfield shined. Its secret wasn't perfection, it was tolerance. British manufacturing was deliberately looser than German standards, with more clearance between moving parts. Engineers might have called it sloppy, but for a soldier in the mud, it meant reliability. When ice or mud gummed up the action, the Lee-Enfield still cycled. The bolt might feel gritty, but it kept moving, keeping the rifle and the soldier alive. The Mauser 98K was a masterpiece of precision engineering, until those same fine tolerances became a liability in the mud and cold of the front. Its front-locking lugs and tight clearances sat right where dirt and grime gathered around the chamber. And when fouling set in, German soldiers often found themselves wrestling to free a jam, while British riflemen simply kept firing. Another subtle but crucial difference was how the two rifles handled spring tension. The Lee-Enfield's design compressed the mainspring when the bolt closed, so opening the bolt was easier. If the action began to bind with dirt or ice, a soldier could still force the bolt open to clear a stoppage or eject a stuck case. The Mauser's system, which put spring resistance into the opening motion, meant you had to fight the mainspring at the same moment you were trying to unstick fouled locking lugs. A painful, sometimes impossible task in freezing weather. British troops in the winter of 1917 often reported their rifles still working when captured German weapons were frozen solid. It wasn't that the Germans cared less for their rifles. Their machines were simply less forgiving. Water and drainage were practical features built into the SMLE. Its magazine had a cutoff so you could fire single shots while keeping the magazine in reserve, and the magazine well drained freely, letting water run out rather than sit around cartridges and rust them. The Mauser's internal stripper clip-fed magazine had no such escape route. Water that got in stayed put, mixed with oil and residue, and turned into a corrosive paste. British armorers who inspected captured Mausers after offensives frequently found rust and corrosion inside the magazines. Even when the outside steel looked clean, even the wood made a difference. The SMLE commonly used Indian walnut, a softer, more forgiving stock that absorbed knocks instead of cracking. Soldiers treated rifles like multi-tools, prying, hammering, driving stakes, and the Lee-Enfield stock often survived brutal use that would shatter the harder beechwood used on many Mauser rifles. A broken stock wasn't just cosmetic. It could ruin accuracy or make a rifle dangerous to fire. Ordnance reports from major offensives showed far fewer catastrophic stock failures on Lee-Enfield's returned for repair than on captured Mausers that suffered the same rough handling. None of this is to deny the Mauser's brilliance. Paul Mauser's 1898 action set a world standard. A controlled feed extractor that gripped the cartridge rim as it left the magazine, dual front locking lugs placed right at the chamber where pressures peak, and a 3-position safety that allowed safe unloading. On paper and on the range, the Mauser was the pinnacle of bolt-action design. But in the filthy, freezing, chaotic reality of the trenches, perfect engineering wasn't always what kept a man alive. The Lee-Enfield's forgiving, pragmatic choices often mattered far more than theoretical superiority. German soldiers trained to be elite marksmen, and their Mauser rifles reflected that philosophy. At 600 yards, a skilled German with a carabiner 98K could easily outshoot a British soldier with an SMLE. But war isn't fought on measured ranges. The Mauser's precision, its greatest strength, was also its biggest limitation. Its controlled feed system required a long, complex bolt motion. Lift the handle a full 90 degrees, pull back, push the new round forward while properly engaging the extractor, then rotate the handle down. Every step had to be exact. Rush it, and the rifle could jam or double feed. Under the stress of battle, cold hands shaking from fear, needing to get rounds downrange immediately, that complexity became a real handicap. German doctrine emphasized deliberate, aimed fire. Soldiers were trained to control their breath, squeeze the trigger precisely, and line up a perfect sight picture. Every shot was meant to count, especially at longer ranges where the Mauser truly excelled. That made sense for late 19th century warfare, where battles were fought at distance and ammunition was precious. But by 1914, and certainly by 1939, the battlefield had changed. Automatic weapons dominated, artillery ruled the skies and fields, and infantry combat was increasingly close and chaotic. This is where the SMLE came into its own. The practical difference was staggering in rate of fire. A trained German soldier could fire 10 to 12 aimed rounds per minute with a carabiner 98K. That was impressive, but half the standard rate of a British SMLE soldier. In a 2-minute firefight, a Brit could send 30 rounds downrange, a German only 24. Those extra 6 rounds could mean the difference between suppressing an enemy, inflicting casualties, or giving your squad the upper hand. Multiply that across a platoon and the gap became decisive. German tactics had to lean heavily on their MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns to make up for rifle fire, whereas British sections could rely on rifles alone. Yes, the Mauser's longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity gave it a flatter trajectory, making it ideal for snipers and long-range shots. But for the average infantryman, that extra precision was wasted. Combat studies from both world wars consistently showed that most soldiers couldn't use a rifle's maximum range under battlefield stress. Noise, confusion, exhaustion, and fear degraded marksmanship far more than any mechanical limitation. The SMLE was accurate enough for real combat, and its faster operation mattered, far more than perfection on a range most soldiers would never see. Magazine capacity sounds like a tiny technical footnote until you're in a firefight and every second and round matters. The Lee-Enfield carried 10 rounds in a detachable box magazine. The Mauser K98K held 5 in an internal magazine fed by stripper clips. That simple 2-to-1 edge changed how battles played out. When a British section opened up, they could sustain fire twice as long before anyone had to stop. And when they did reload, a practiced soldier could drop an empty magazine and slot in a fresh one in about 3 seconds. Chamber, shoulder, and back into the fight. A German rifleman had to open the bolt, slip a 5-round stripper clip into the guide, press the cartridges down with his thumb, yank out the empty clip, then chamber the first round. Even in calm conditions, that took 6 to 8 seconds, longer if the clip snagged or the mud grabbed it. Multiply that difference across a squad and it becomes decisive. A standard British section of 10 men could pour 100 rounds downrange before the first reload. A German squad of the same size managed 50. In a 2-minute exchange, assuming trained rates of fire, the British section might send roughly 300 rounds while the Germans put out 200-240. Those extra shots weren't just wasted lead, they meant sustained suppression, fewer enemy movements, and more chances to flank or advance. While one side fiddled with stripper clips, the other kept pressure on. The detachable magazine also created tactical flexibility. British webbing was set up to hold loaded magazines ready to go. 2 pouches carrying 5 10-round magazines each was standard issue. That's 50 instant rounds at your hip, plus another 50 loose rounds in bandoliers for topping up magazines during quiet moments. You could fire 50 aimed rounds in under 4 minutes without hunting for loose cartridges. German pouches built around stripper clips were efficient for that system, but under stress, losing a metal clip in mud or grass could turn 5 rounds into scrap. A small but brilliant feature was the SMLE's magazine cutoff. Engage it, and the rifle becomes a single shot while the magazine stays loaded and waiting. That meant you could pick off targets carefully to conserve ammo, then flick the cutoff, and unleash 10 rounds the instant things went hot. Mausers had no slick equivalent. You either used the magazine or loaded single rounds, with no seamless switch. Even reloading ergonomics favored the Lee-Enfield. Its magazine well was roomy and beveled, guiding magazines in quickly even with numb fingers or in rain and grime. All these details, the extra rounds, fast magazine swaps, carry arrangement, cutoff, and generous well, added up. On the battlefield, where seconds and continuous fire decide who moves and who dies, the Lee-Enfield's magazine system wasn't a minor convenience. It was a tactical multiplier, even in the pitch dark or after hours of marching when hands shook with exhaustion. A soldier could reload a Lee-Enfield by feel. The magazine catch was perfectly placed, just where your trigger finger naturally landed when shifting grip. One press, the empty dropped free, slide in a fresh magazine, push until it clicked, and you were back in the fight. The Mauser's internal magazine might sound convenient, but it had no quick reload option. Once those 5 rounds were gone, you had to feed the rifle slowly, 1 cartridge or clip at a time. German soldiers admired the British system, even while taking pride in the other qualities of their rifles. Private Harold Bolton of the Royal Warshire Regiment wrote home in October 1914 about a small but telling moment after the First Battle of Ypres. His section had overrun a German position and found several abandoned Mausers in perfect condition. The men examined them carefully. They were, after all, the rifles that German propaganda claimed were superior. Bolton's sergeant, a career soldier with 12 years of service, worked the Mauser's action, peered down the barrel, and handed it back with a wry remark. "Fine weapon for a Sunday shoot. I'll keep my Lee-Enfield for killing Germans, thanks." The captured rifles went to headquarters, but every man kept his SMLE. This wasn't a one-off. Across both world wars, after major battles, British and Commonwealth troops often had opportunities to pick up German rifles. Some kept them as souvenirs, some used captured ammo when supplies ran low. But almost always, they stuck with their Lee-Enfield's. Corporal Jack Thomas, who fought with the 8th Army in North Africa, wrote in his diary after the fighting around the Maratha line in January 1943. His platoon had raided a German supply dump. Ammunition, food, even a few MP-40 submachine guns were taken, but the captured Carabiner 98Ks were left behind. Thomas noted, "The lads won't trade their rifles. Jerry's looks smart, but ours shoots faster. And that's what counts when they're running at you." Lieutenant William Douglas Home, serving with the Royal Armored Corps, echoed the same sentiment in letters later published. Soldiers didn't need propaganda or technical manuals to know what worked in the mud, blood, and chaos of real combat. Their choice was clear. The Lee-Enfield was the rifle they trusted to keep them alive. In July 1944, during the Normandy campaign, Douglas Home interrogated German prisoners and quickly realized the respect they had for British marksmanship and firepower. One German sergeant, speaking through a translator, confessed that during a fight near Caen, his squad had been convinced they were facing automatic weapons. When Home explained it was just bolt-action rifles, the sergeant refused to believe him. He had counted the fire coming in and was sure no bolt action could keep up. Home then demonstrated the mad minute technique with an SMLE, and the sergeant's face told the whole story. a mix of grudging respect and sheer frustration at being outperformed by what he had assumed was obsolete equipment. This admiration wasn't limited to British troops. Indian soldiers, who made up a large portion of Commonwealth forces, were equally devoted to the rifle they called the 303. Sepoy Gian Singh of the 4th Indian Division wrote to his family in Punjabi about the 1941 East African campaign against Italian forces. His unit had captured Italian Carcano rifles and German Mausers from colonial troops, but when Singh tried a Mauser in battle, he found it too slow for practical fighting, only good for careful, deliberate shooting. The Indian Army had been using the Lee-Enfield since 1905, and soldiers from the northwest frontier to Burma consistently praised its speed and reliability. Time and again, their accounts emphasized that the SMLE kept working when other rifles failed, even under desert heat, monsoon humidity, and freezing mountain cold. Australian soldiers were famously pragmatic about gear. If a captured weapon was better, they used it. No questions asked. Sergeant Bill Griffiths, who fought at Tobruk and in the campaigns across l'Allemagne with the 9th Australian Division, recorded in his post-war memoir that Australians constantly evaluated captured German equipment. They happily adopted German stick grenades, optical sights, and machine guns when they were superior to British versions. Yet Griffith noted he never saw an Australian soldier voluntarily trade his Lee-Enfield for a captured rifle. His explanation was simple: it works. Shoots straight enough, shoots fast enough, why switch? The North African desert tested rifles like no European battlefield ever could. Sand ground into every mechanism like sandpaper, while freezing nights followed by 120-degree days expanded and contracted metal parts. Moisture from the coast mixed with sand to form a corrosive paste that could ruin lesser rifles in weeks. Across Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia from 1940 to 1943, British forces found the SMLE handled these brutal conditions better than almost any other rifle in the theater, earning the unwavering loyalty of the men who carried it. German troops admired the Mauser's precision, but their field manuals were packed with complex instructions just to keep the K98K running in harsh conditions. The British approach was far simpler: shake out the sand and keep firing. What engineers had criticized as loose tolerances turned out to be salvation in the desert. Sand that would jam a Mauser's tight action simply fell harmlessly through the Lee-Enfield's generous clearances. Australian and New Zealand troops at Tobruk fought through sandstorms where visibility dropped to mere arm's length. When the storms cleared, their rifles still functioned. The Italian Carcano rifles used by their opponents often seized completely, needing full disassembly to work again. Even the Mauser struggled until meticulously cleaned. British armorers noted that Lee-Enfields returned from Tobruk with sand caked inside the action, but most were still battle-ready. One rifle had fired over 200 rounds during a 3-day fight without cleaning and remained operational. When inspected in August 1941, the jungles and monsoons of Burma in the Pacific offered an entirely different challenge. Torrential rains, constant humidity, and deep mud made European battlefields look tame. The 14th Army, operating in Burma from 1942 to 1945, faced conditions where metal could rust overnight and wooden stocks swell from moisture. Japanese Arisaka rifles, excellent on paper, often jammed as humidity warped their chrome-lined barrels or caused feeding issues. The SMLE, with its unlined bore, needed more frequent cleaning but resisted the pitting and corrosion that ruined chrome barrels when plating failed. Its walnut stocks absorbed moisture without warping as dramatically as the denser woods used in Japanese or some German rifles. British soldiers often went weeks without proper maintenance facilities. Sergeant Charles Carfrey of the Border Regiment described his Lee-Enfield after 3 weeks in the jungle. In early 1944, the metal was spotted with surface rust, the stock nearly black from handling and damp, and the barrel fouled from hundreds of rounds. Yet when his unit engaged Japanese positions at Nakadok Pass, the rifle worked flawlessly. Captured Japanese rifles, though in better cosmetic condition, failed to cycle reliably because moisture had compromised their tighter actions. And then there was the Arctic, a testing ground all its own. In the Arctic and Northern Europe, Winter wasn't just cold, it was weapon-killing cold. British and Canadian troops in Norway in 1940, and later Allied units during the winter of 1944-45, faced temperatures well below 0 Fahrenheit. Grease and oils turned to jelly, metal shrank, and any moisture froze on contact. The German answer was special cold weather lubricants and strict maintenance routines. Useful if you could get them. Less so if you couldn't. The British answer was almost brutally simple. Strip the oil out and run the Lee-Enfield dry. The rifle's design tolerated running without lubrication, and the result was weapons that kept working when others locked. Canadians fighting in the Scheldt estuary in November 1944 noted Lee-Enfields firing reliably through sleet and freezing rain while captured German rifles lay frozen and useless. The SMLE's bolt action required less force to operate, a life-saving advantage when metal had contracted in the cold and every movement felt like pushing through straps. This Lee-Enfield service life tells its own argument against the idea that newer equals better. Born as the Magazine Lee-Enfield in 1895, refined into the SMLE by 1907, it didn't just survive 2 world wars. It stayed in frontline and secondary service for decades afterward. India produced Enfields into the 1980s. The rifle saw action in Korea, Malaya, Kenya, Suez, and even the Falklands. Canadian Rangers used the number 4 Mach well into the 21st century. Rifles directly descended from a design first fielded in 1895, no other bolt action. Service rifle comes close to that kind of longevity. By contrast, the technically brilliant Mauser K98K, the American Springfield 1903, the Japanese Arisaka, and the Soviet Mosin Nagant were largely phased out within a generation after 1945. The Lee-Enfield endured not out of habit, but because it solved the practical problems soldiers actually faced. It wasn't designed to win awards for bench accuracy or dial-in tolerances. It was built to keep firing when dirt, rain, sand, heat, cold, and exhaustion were doing their best to stop it. In short, the Lee-Enfield didn't chase perfect specs. It delivered what mattered most on the battlefield: reliable, fast, and forgiving performance. The SMLE's genius wasn't in flashy engineering or elegant mechanics. It was in reliability, simplicity, and consistent performance under stress. Compared to the Mauser's technical sophistication, these priorities might have seemed almost mundane. Yet, on the battlefield, they mattered far more than pinpoint accuracy that most soldiers couldn't exploit. The Lee-Enfield embodied a philosophy. What works in the field is worth more than perfection on paper. Modern small arms development keeps relearning these lessons. Early M16 rifles in Vietnam jammed frequently because tight tolerances made them vulnerable to dirt and grime, the same problem that plagued Mausers in mud and sand decades earlier. The fixes, looser tolerances, chrome lining, forgiving design, echoed the principles the SMLE had championed since 1907. The AK-47's legendary reliability also comes from generous clearances, allowing it to function in dust, mud, and snow, exactly the same reason Lee-Enfields excelled in trenches and deserts decades before. Today's doctrine, prioritizing volume of fire and rapid engagement at close to medium ranges over extreme long-range marksmanship, reflects the same thinking that led Britain to emphasize the mad minute rather than 1,000-yard precision. The Lee-Enfield story offers broader lessons about military technology and procurement. Advanced engineering doesn't automatically mean superiority in combat. The Mauser was technically brilliant: controlled feed, dual front locking lugs, top-quality metallurgy. Yet its sophistication brought complexity, and complexity brings failure points. The SMLE thrived because it was simple, forgiving, and easy to maintain. Loose tolerances, rear locking bolts, and a straightforward manual of arms meant soldiers could use it effectively under extreme conditions, even without gunsmith-level skills. That matters because wars are fought not just by elite soldiers but by conscripts and reservists. A weapon that works adequately in anyone's hands is far more valuable than one that excels only in expert hands. The economic lesson is equally important. Britain produced roughly 17 million Lee-Enfields between 1895 and the 1950s. Its simpler design allowed faster factory setup, quicker worker training, and lower production costs than the precision-heavy Mauser. During World War II, industrial capacity often determined victory. Britain could arm its forces, supply allies, and even support resistance movements worldwide with good enough rifles in quantity, while Germany, producing technically superior rifles, never had enough to fully equip its armies. Adequate weapons in sufficient numbers beat perfect weapons in limited supply every time. The Lee-Enfield showed that old doesn't mean outdated, and new doesn't automatically mean better. It proved that knowing how soldiers really fight, in mud, rain, heat, cold, and chaos, matters far more than what looks impressive on paper. Above all, it taught that the best weapon isn't the one that wins engineering awards. It's the one that keeps firing when everything else fails. The rifle soldiers trusted with their lives, the one that brought them home, earned that trust through reliability, speed, and simplicity. The British Tommy's loyalty to his outdated Lee-Enfield wasn't stubbornness, it was battlefield wisdom.